If you fit into that dress, I'll marry you." The millionaire's son scoffed, raising his champagne glass as he pointed to the red dress hanging in the center of the hall. The explosion of laughter was instantaneous. About 180 guests at the Metropolitan Fashion Gala in Manhattan turned to see who was the butt of the joke. Sophie Bennett, 28, a cleaning lady at the hotel hosting the event, froze in the corner of the hallway with her cleaning cart still in her hands. Her gray uniform, 2 sizes too big, hung loosely on her overly thin body, hiding the curves she had learned to conceal from the world. Brandon Westfield, 32, heir to a real estate empire valued at $2.8 billion, laughed too loudly. It was the kind of performative laughter of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. Perfectly combed blonde hair, a $15,000 Italian suit, a Swiss watch that cost more than Sophie's annual salary. "I'm serious," he continued, gesturing dramatically with his glass. "Does anyone have a pen and paper? Let's draw up a contract right now." The dress in question was the centerpiece of the exhibition. An exclusive creation by French designer Camille Laurent, valued at $780,000. Size 0, fitted waist, structured neckline. A work of art made for bodies sculpted in elite gyms and maintained by private nutritionists. Sophie felt heat rise to her neck, tinging her face red, which contrasted cruelly with her dark skin. Her eyes filled with tears, which she blinked frantically to hold back. Not here. Not in front of them. She had learned over the past 7 years working at luxury events that rich people had a special talent for turning humiliation into entertainment. "Come on, honey." A woman in a gold dress cut through the air. "Accept the proposal. Single billionaires don't come along every day." More laughter. Cell phone flashes. Recording the moment for Instagram stories. #Metropolitan Gala #funny moments. Sophie lowered her head, gripping the handle of the cleaning cart so tightly that her knuckles turned white, and began to walk away. Each step was a struggle against the urge to run. Each laugh behind her back was a stab in the heart. "Hey, wait!" Brandon shouted, his voice still tinged with cruel amusement. "Don't run away. The offer still stands. 90 days. If you fit into that dress in 90 days, I'll keep my word." The crowd cheered as if they were watching a show. Sophie didn't look back. She pushed the cart through the service door, and as soon as the door closed, muffling the sound of laughter, she leaned against the cold wall of the hallway and finally let the tears fall. But something happened in that empty hallway between stacks of folded towels and the smell of cleaning products. Something inside her didn't break. It transformed. Shame began to boil until it turned into something else. Anger. Determination. Promise. What none of those guests knew was that Sophie Bennett wasn't just a cleaning lady. 7 years ago, she was a fashion design student at Parsons School of Design, on a full scholarship with perfect grades, until her father suffered a devastating stroke at age 58. Sophie had to choose between her dreams and her family's survival. She chose survival. She dropped out of college after 3 semesters before completing her first year, took on 2 jobs, and cared for her father, who was partially paralyzed on his right side. For 7 years, she swallowed humiliations like that because she needed the money to pay for physical therapy, medication, and rent for a tiny apartment in the Bronx. But that night, something changed. Sophie wiped her tears with the back of her hand, straightened her shoulders, and made a silent promise. In 90 days, she would return. Not for a ridiculous wedding, not for their approval, but to prove that no one had the right to define her by her appearance or position. What Brandon Westfield also didn't know was that an innocent joke was about to set off a chain of events that would not only destroy his carefully constructed reputation, but expose secrets he had buried deep beneath layers of money and influence. Because Sophie would not be returning alone. And when she did return, it would not only be her body that had changed. While Brandon continued laughing with friends, circling the room like a peacock, distributing handshakes and overly white smiles, someone at the back of the event watched the scene with a completely different expression. Nora Chun, 45, an investigative journalist for the New York Chronicle, had covered dozens of Westfield family charity events over the past 10 years. And there was something about that public humiliation that triggered an instinct she had developed after 20 years in the profession. Nora discreetly filmed the entire interaction with her cell phone. And when Sophie ran out, Nora followed her. In the service corridor, she found Sophie sitting on the floor, her back against the wall, her face hidden between her knees. "Sorry to bother you," Nora said softly, crouching down. "My name is Nora Chun. I'm a journalist. And I just filmed everything that happened in there." Sophie lifted her face, her eyes red and swollen. "Why?" "Because men like Brandon Westfield have been doing this for years and no one holds them accountable. But this time," Nora paused, looking directly into Sophie's eyes. "This time, I have a feeling the story will be different." She held out her business card. "If you decide to do something about this, come see me. I have resources that can help. And I have files on the Westfield family that you might find interesting." Sophie took the card with trembling hands, but something in Nora's voice, in the steadiness of her gaze, planted a seed that would begin to grow in the coming hours. If you're enjoying this story about a woman who everyone underestimated but who carries within her the strength to turn everything upside down, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what happens in the next 90 days will prove that underestimating someone who has nothing to lose is the most expensive mistake any billionaire can make. Sophie didn't sleep that night. Sitting in the cramped kitchen of her Bronx apartment, she opened her old laptop and typed a name into the search bar: Brandon Westfield. Results flooded the screen. Articles about the family's real estate company, photos on yachts, charity dinners where the Westfields donated millions to photogenic causes. But among the glamorous news, Sophie found something different. An obscure forum for former Westfield employees. Labor complaints filed discreetly. Rumors of out-of-court settlements with women who had worked for the family. And Brandon's name appeared repeatedly, always involved in incidents that were resolved with checks and confidentiality agreements. "Interesting," Sophie muttered, methodically saving links. The next morning at 6 a.m., she called Nora Chun. "You said you had files on the Westfield family," Sophie got straight to the point. "Can I see them?" They met at a discreet cafe in Queens 2 hours later. Nora brought a thick folder with documents, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes accumulated over a decade. "Brandon Westfield isn't just an arrogant heir," Nora began, sliding the first page across the table. "He's a systematic predator. Over the past 8 years, at least 12 women have received financial settlements after alleging harassment or inappropriate behavior. All of them signed confidentiality agreements." Sophie looked at the photo of Brandon smiling at a charity event. How did he get away with it? Money. Expensive lawyers. And his father, Robert Westfield, who controls every aspect of the family's public image. Nora paused. But there's more. Brandon has a pattern. He chooses women in vulnerable positions: employees, waitresses, service professionals. People who depend on their jobs and are afraid to speak up. "Like you," Sophie said softly. "Like you," Nora confirmed. "But this time he made a mistake. He humiliated you publicly, in front of witnesses, and it was filmed. That can't be buried with a check." Sophie took a deep breath. "What do I need to do?" "First, we need more than just the video of the humiliation. We need documented evidence. And I know where to start." That's how Sophie met Elena Rodriguez. Elena, 34, had worked as an events manager for Westfield Properties for 6 years. In 2021, Brandon repeatedly harassed her during a company convention in Miami. When she rejected his advances, she was fired for poor performance. The labor lawsuit was settled out of court for $180,000 with a confidentiality clause. "He destroyed my career," Elena said when they met at her apartment in Brooklyn. "No one in the industry wants to hire me. He spread rumors that I'm difficult to work with and emotionally unstable." It's all a lie. But Elena had kept copies of emails, text messages, and recordings of conversations. "I knew I would need them one day," she explained. "The confidentiality agreement doesn't prevent me from having evidence. It just prevents me from talking about it publicly. What if there was a way to expose everything without breaking the agreement?" Sophie asked. Elena looked at her with renewed interest. "Go on." While Sophie built a network of allies, Brandon continued his life as if nothing had happened. But something was starting to bother him. A video of the humiliation was circulating online. It initially appeared on an anonymous Twitter account with a simple caption: "Billionaire mocks cleaning lady at charity event. This is who they really are." Within 48 hours, it had 800,000 views. The comments were brutal. "This guy is disgusting. Imagine having so much money and so little class. Does anyone know who the woman is? I want to send her money. The Westfield family always presents itself as philanthropic, but look how they treat real people. Brandon called his public relations team to an emergency meeting in his luxurious Park Avenue office. Get this off the internet, he ordered, pounding his fist on the mahogany table. Now. Sir, we tried, the PR manager replied nervously. But the more we remove it, the more people repost it. There's an online petition with 25,000 signatures demanding a public apology. Apologize. Brandon laughed humorlessly. For a joke? She's a cleaning lady, for God's sake. No one really cares. The media cares, the manager continued. The New York Chronicle published an article about elitist behavior patterns. They mentioned the company's name. For the first time, Brandon felt a twinge of real concern. Not guilt. Concern for the company's image. Make a statement, he said finally. Something about a misunderstanding, misplaced humor, apologies if anyone was offended. The usual. But the generic statement only added fuel to the fire. Criticism intensified. Westfield Properties stock fell 3% in 2 days. The board of directors began asking uncomfortable questions. Robert Westfield, the 68-year-old patriarch, summoned his son to dinner at a private club. You're becoming a problem, Robert said coldly, cutting into his steak. This cleaning lady situation is affecting business. The board is concerned. It's a storm in a teacup, Brandon replied, sipping $500 a bottle red wine. It'll blow over. It won't blow over if she decides to sue. Or worse, if other women start talking. Robert stared at his son. You've been careless, Brandon. Again. I took care of everything. You paid checks, Robert interrupted. That's not taking care of it. It's hiding it. And eventually, the pile of buried secrets gets too high. Brandon felt anger boiling up. So what do you suggest? Offer a real apology. In person. On video. Show humility for the first time in your privileged life. Never, Brandon spat. I won't stoop to. Then prepare for consequences, Robert said, rising from the table. Because this time, not even my money will protect you if you decide not to cooperate. While Brandon struggled with his wounded ego, Sophie was undergoing a different transformation. Not just physical, but mental. With Elena's help, she contacted 5 other women who had received settlements from Brandon. They all had similar stories. They all had evidence stored away. And they were all tired of bought silence. We need more than labor evidence, Sophie said during a meeting at Nora's apartment. We need to show who he really is when no one is looking. That's when Nora revealed a contact that would change everything. I know someone who works as a security guard in Brandon's residential building. He has access to security camera recordings. And he's willing to help because Brandon treated his sister terribly when she worked as a maid. Is that legal? Sophie asked. It's a gray area, Nora admitted. But sometimes, to expose the truth, we have to be willing to take risks. Sophie thought of her father at home, dependent on physical therapy that she paid for with her cleaning salary. She thought of 7 years of swallowing humiliation. She thought of all the women Brandon had silenced with money. Get in touch, she said finally. 3 days later, Sophie received a flash drive in the mail. Inside were recordings from security cameras in Brandon's building. Nothing illegal, just moments that showed how he treated employees when he thought no one important was watching. Brandon yelling at the doorman for holding the door wrong. Brandon pushing the delivery man who brought food late. Brandon making degrading comments about the building cleaner's appearance. Each clip was a small act of cruelty. Together, they painted a devastating portrait of a man who saw service people as subhuman. This is gold, Nora said, watching the recordings. But it's still not enough. We need something to tie it all together. Something irrefutable. Sophie glanced at the calendar on the wall. 30 days had passed since the humiliation. 60 days remained until the 90-day deadline Brandon had set. I have an idea, she said slowly. But it will require me to go back to that world. Close to him. It's risky, Nora warned. I know. Sophie straightened her shoulders, feeling a determination she hadn't felt in years. But men like Brandon only make mistakes when they think they've already won. I need to make him think he's winning. Until the moment he loses everything. Sophie spent the following week executing the riskiest plan she had ever considered. With Nora's help, she secured a temporary transfer to the cleaning crew at Westfield Tower, the family's main corporate building on Park Avenue. Are you sure about this? Elena asked when Sophie explained her strategy. He'll recognize you. That's the point, Sophie replied. I want him to see me. I want him to think I'm there because of the humiliation, trying to improve my situation. Men like Brandon love to believe they control the narrative. On her first day working at Westfield Tower, Sophie was cleaning a conference room on the 42nd floor when Brandon walked down the hall. He paused, looked at her for 3 long seconds, and then smiled that arrogant smile. You, he said, entering the room. The woman in the dress. Working here now. Sophie lowered her eyes, feigning submission. Yes, sir. I got a transfer. The pay is better. Brandon laughed. Of course it is. And how are the preparations going? There are 60 days left until the deadline. Have you managed to lose weight? The casual cruelty in his voice made anger burn in Sophie's stomach, but she kept her expression neutral. I'm trying, sir. Adorable, Brandon said, his tone dripping with condescension. You know, I'm impressed by your persistence. Most people would have given up after that night. But you actually believe you can transform yourself into something presentable. He moved closer, invading her personal space in a way that made Sophie's skin crawl. Let me give you some advice. People like you aren't meant for spaces like this. You can clean them, serve in them, but you'll never belong here. The sooner you accept that, the happier you'll be. Sophie forced tears to well up in her eyes, playing the role of the broken woman he expected to see. Yes, sir. I understand. Good girl, Brandon said, patting her condescendingly on the shoulder before leaving. The moment the door closed, Sophie pulled out the small recorder Nora had hidden under her uniform. Every word captured. Every nuance of contempt recorded. Over the next 3 weeks, Sophie meticulously documented everything. Brandon seemed unable to resist the opportunity to humiliate her whenever he saw her. Each encounter was a new display of casual cruelty. Still trying to fit into that dress? He would ask in an elevator full of executives, provoking uncomfortable laughter. I bet you don't even know how to use a dessert fork, he commented when he saw her cleaning the executive dining room. My dog has more class than you, he once said when she was on her knees scrubbing the marble floor. Every insult was recorded. Every witness noted. Sophie was building not only a harassment case, but a complete portrait of a man who saw working-class people as disposable entertainment. But the real twist came when Sophie discovered something even Nora hadn't expected. Cleaning Brandon's office late one night, he always left the door unlocked because who would steal from Westfield? Sophie found his laptop open on the desk. The screen showed an incomplete email to the family lawyer. Curiosity got the better of her. Sophie quickly took photos of the screen with her cell phone. The email discussed the Elena Rodriguez problem, mentioning false evidence planted in her performance file, and the need to discredit her before she speaks again. Sophie's heart raced. This wasn't just harassment. It was an active conspiracy to destroy the victim's reputation. She continued scrolling through open emails. She found 3 more conversations about other women, all discussing strategies to manage the narrative and protect the Westfield brand in case any of them became a problem. Sophie photographed everything, her hands shaking. It was 11:47 p.m. She knew Brandon sometimes came back to the office late. She had to leave. Now. But as she turned toward the door, she heard voices in the hallway. Brandon and another man. Panic flooded Sophie's system. If he found her there, with her cell phone in her hands, near his laptop. She hid behind a tall cabinet in the corner of the office, just as the door opened. I don't care what the council says, Brandon's voice echoed. The woman is a cleaning lady. No one will believe her over me. The media is paying attention, Brandon, an older voice replied. Sophie recognized it as Robert Westfield's. The video has 2 million views now. It's not going away. Then we make it disappear, Brandon said casually. We find a way to fire her. We claim theft, inappropriate behavior, anything. Once her credibility is destroyed, no one will want to hear her story. Sophie held her breath, pressing herself against the wall behind the cabinet. "Are you suggesting we fabricate charges?" Robert asked, his tone indecipherable. "I'm suggesting we protect the family. Like we always have." There was a long pause. Then Robert sighed. "I have a meeting in 10 minutes. Lock the office when you leave." Footsteps receded. The door closed. Sophie waited 5 agonizing minutes before venturing to look. The office was empty. She left quickly, her heart pounding, and sent a message to Nora, "We have a problem. And we have gold." They met at Nora's apartment an hour later. Sophie showed her photos of the emails and played the recording of the conversation between Brandon and her father. "This changes everything," Elena said, studying the evidence. "It's not just harassment now. It's criminal conspiracy to commit fraud, intentional defamation, obstruction of justice." "And it shows a systematic pattern," Nora added. "It's not Brandon acting alone. It's a full-blown family operation to cover up crimes." "But how do we use this without revealing that Sophie invaded privacy?" another woman in the group, Sarah, asked. Sophie thought for a moment. "We don't use it yet. That's our final weapon. First, we let Brandon think he's winning. That his plan to discredit me is working." "You want him to fire you?" Nora asked, confused. "I want him to try," Sophie corrected. "I want him to do exactly what he said he would do. Because when he plants the false evidence, we'll have proof of a crime in progress. And then we reveal that we have a recording of him planning everything." Elena smiled slowly. "You want to trap him with his own words." "Exactly." The plan was risky. It required Sophie to put herself in a vulnerable position, waiting for Brandon to attack. But it was also the only way to get irrefutable evidence that no expensive lawyer could make disappear. In the days that followed, Sophie noticed subtle changes. Her supervisor began to watch her more closely. Small mistakes appeared in her work reports, rooms she supposedly forgot to clean, equipment that disappeared during her shift. It was all very convenient. It all built a narrative of an incompetent and potentially dishonest employee. Sophie documented every false accusation, every fabricated report. And she waited. The final trap came 3 weeks before the 90-day deadline. Sophie arrived for her shift and was called to the Human Resources office. "Miss Bennett," the HR manager said, his expression serious. "There has been a serious accusation. A Rolex watch valued at $45,000 has disappeared from Mr. Brandon Westfield's office. Security cameras show you as the last person to clean that office last night." Sophie felt her blood run cold, but she kept her composure. "I didn't take any watch. You can search my things." "We already have," the manager replied. "And we found this in your locker." She slid a photo across the desk. It showed a Rolex watch in a plastic bag among the uniforms in Sophie's locker. "That's impossible," Sophie said, her voice genuinely shaking. "Someone planted it. I never." "Miss Bennett, I understand you're under financial pressure," the manager interrupted with false sympathy. "Perhaps you saw an opportunity and made an error in judgment. If you return the watch and resign quietly, the Westfield family is willing to not involve the police." There it was. Exactly as Brandon had planned. Planted evidence, a convenient witness, and an offer of mercy that would force Sophie to disappear quietly. Sophie took a deep breath. Time to play her last card. "I'd like to speak to a lawyer before signing anything," she said calmly. The manager's expression hardened. "That's non-negotiable." "Actually, it is," Nora's voice cut in as she entered the room followed by 2 lawyers and a private investigator. "I'm Nora Chun, a journalist with the New York Chronicle. And this is a documented attempt to falsely incriminate my client." The HR manager paled. "How dare you come in?" "We have a recording of Brandon Westfield planning this exact scenario 3 weeks ago," one of the lawyers interrupted, placing a small device on the table. "We have emails from him discussing how to plant evidence. And we have 14 witnesses willing to testify about similar patterns of behavior." Sophie looked at the manager, seeing panic replace confidence. "You can keep the watch," she said softly. "Because when we're done, it won't be worth a fraction of what the Westfield family is going to lose." The conference room on the 42nd floor of Westfield Tower was full when Brandon arrived for what he thought was a routine meeting with the legal department. But when he opened the door, he froze. Seated around the table were Robert Westfield, his father, 3 members of the board of directors, 2 outside lawyers he had never seen before, and Sophie Bennett. "What the hell is going on?" Brandon demanded, looking at his father. "Why is she here?" "Sit down, Brandon," Robert said, his voice cold as ice. "Now." Brandon sat down slowly, looking around the room with growing discomfort. One of the unfamiliar lawyers opened a laptop. "Mr. Westfield," the lawyer began formally, "we are here to discuss extremely serious allegations made against you by Miss Sophie Bennett and 6 other women." "This is ridiculous." Brandon began to stand up. "I'm not going to." "You're going to sit down and listen," Robert cut him off, his voice carrying an authority that Brandon rarely dared to challenge. "Because in the last 48 hours, I've discovered things about my son that deeply embarrass me." The lawyer clicked a button. Brandon's voice filled the room, a crystal-clear recording of the conversation in the office 3 weeks ago. "Then we make her disappear. We find a way to fire her. We claim theft, inappropriate behavior, anything." Brandon's face drained of color. "This recording," the lawyer continued, "was obtained legally in a space where you had no expectation of privacy. But there's more." The laptop screen projected onto the wall. Emails began to appear. Each one showed Brandon or his associates discussing how to manage women who had complained about him. Plans to plant false evidence. Strategies to destroy reputations. Payments to silence witnesses. "These emails," another lawyer said, "constitute evidence of criminal conspiracy, fraud, intentional defamation, and obstruction of justice in at least 8 separate cases over the past 6 years. Brandon finally found his voice. "Where did you get this? This is invasion of privacy." "You left your laptop unlocked in an open office," Sophie said for the first time, her voice calm but firm. "I was cleaning. I saw the screen. I took pictures. Perfectly legal." "You little," Brandon began, but Robert slammed his fist on the table with such force that everyone jumped. "Shut up." Robert looked at his son with a mixture of anger and disappointment. "Do you know how many years I spent building this family's reputation? How many millions we donated to charity? How many bridges we built in the community? And you destroyed it all because you can't keep your hands off female employees and your ego won't allow you to treat people with basic dignity." He turned to the lawyers. "How much damage?" "Substantial," one of them replied. "If these women file a class action lawsuit, we're looking at potential punitive damages in the hundreds of millions. If the prosecution decides to pursue criminal charges for evidence of conspiracy and fraud, Brandon could face 5 to 10 years in prison." A heavy silence fell over the room. Brandon looked around, finally understanding the magnitude of what he was facing. "But there is an alternative," Sophie said, taking everyone by surprise. Robert looked at her. "Go on." "I don't want the Westfield family's money," Sophie said clearly. "I don't want to destroy a company that employs 3,000 people who have done nothing wrong. What I want is real justice. And real change." She slid a document across the table. "These are my conditions. And those of the other 6 women." Robert picked up the document, reading aloud. 1. Brandon Westfield immediately resigns from all positions at Westfield Properties and associated companies. 2. Brandon issues a public video apology to each woman he harassed, using their full names and detailing specifically what he did. 3. Westfield Properties establishes a $20 million fund for anti-harassment training and victim support, administered independently. 4. The Westfield family funds full scholarships for Sophie Bennett and any other victims who wish to continue their education. 5. Brandon agrees to complete 2,000 hours of community service in women's shelters, where he will learn to see the people he treated as disposable. Robert continued reading silently, then looked up at Sophie with something resembling respect. "What if we agree?" "Then we don't prosecute him criminally," Sophie replied. "We don't leak recordings to the media. We don't destroy the entire family's legacy because of one broken man." Brandon finally exploded. "You can't force me." "We can," one of the board members interrupted. "Because the alternative is you going to prison and dragging the family name through the mud for years of public trial. We accept Miss Bennett's terms." "The board has no authority," Brandon began. The board just voted unanimously to remove you from all positions, Robert said coldly. Including the family trust. You have two choices, Brandon. Accept her terms, or face criminal prosecution with zero resources from the family. Choose. Brandon looked around the table, seeing only determined faces. Finally, the realization hit him like a brick. He had lost. Completely. How long do I have to decide? He asked, his voice breaking. You decide now, Sophie said, looking him directly in the eye for the first time. Because in 10 minutes, Nora Chun of the New York Chronicle will publish an article with all this evidence. Unless I call her and tell her to hold the story. Brandon felt the walls closing in. What about the dress? He asked bitterly. 90 days haven't passed yet. Sophie stood up, removing the blazer she was wearing. Underneath, she wore a red dress. That $780,000 red dress. It fit perfectly. I got it 3 weeks ago, she said calmly. But this was never about the dress, was it? It was about you needing to put someone down to feel big. About using power to humiliate people you saw as inferior. She walked over to where Brandon was sitting, looking down at him for the first time. You know what I learned in those 90 days? That the problem was never that I didn't fit into the dress. The problem was that you didn't fit into the role of a decent human being. Brandon lowered his eyes, defeated. Sign the papers, Robert ordered, pushing the papers across the table. Now. With trembling hands, Brandon signed. Each signature was a confession. Each initial was an admission of defeat. When he was done, Sophie picked up her phone and called. Nora? Hold on. We've reached an agreement. She hung up and looked at Brandon one last time. You have 48 hours to record apology videos. And they need to be sincere. Because if they're not, the agreement is cancelled and everything comes out. Sophie turned to leave, but stopped at the door. Oh, and Brandon? The dress isn't worth $780,000. Designer Camille Laurent told me yesterday that its real value is $320,000. The rest was gallery markup. You didn't even know the true value of the thing you bet on. Fitting for a man who doesn't know the value of anything, especially people. She left, leaving Brandon sitting in the ruins of the empire he had helped destroy. In the hallway, Elena waited with 5 other women. When Sophie appeared, they all hugged, tears of relief and victory mingling. You did it, Elena whispered. We did it. It's not over yet, Sophie said. We have to make sure he honors the agreement. And that changes actually happen. But for the first time in 90 days, for the first time in 7 years, Sophie felt something she had forgotten was possible. Hope. 2 days later, Brandon posted a series of videos on YouTube. In each one, sitting in a simple chair without professional makeup or elaborate production, he looked at the camera and named the woman he had harmed. Elena Rodriguez, I repeatedly harassed you during the convention in Miami. When you refused, I fired you and spread lies about your professional character. I was wrong. I apologize. Sarah Chun, I made inappropriate comments about your appearance and created a hostile work environment. You didn't deserve that. I apologize. One by one, he confessed. And although his voice was monotonous, his words were specific enough not to sound scripted by lawyers. The videos went viral instantly. But this time, the narrative was different. The comments were about accountability, about women who had the courage to speak out, about Sophie Bennett who turned humiliation into justice. Sophie Bennett, Brandon said in the last video, his voice finally breaking, I tried to humiliate you publicly. I treated you as entertainment. Then I tried to destroy your reputation and your life. You had every right to destroy me completely. But instead, you gave me a chance to learn. I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I will spend the rest of my life trying to be the man you believed I could become. When the video ended, Sophie was watching it in Nora's apartment surrounded by all the women who had fought alongside her. No one applauded. No one celebrated. They just sat in silence, understanding the weight of the moment. Is it enough? Sarah finally asked. It will never be enough to undo the damage, Sophie replied honestly. But it's a start. And sometimes, a start is all we can ask for. 6 months later, Sophie Bennett adjusted her cap and gown as she entered the auditorium at Parsons School of Design. 500 people filled the space, students, teachers, family members, and a few surprising faces she never imagined she would see. She was no longer wearing her gray cleaning uniform. Not because she was ashamed of those years, but because she had finally reclaimed the dream she had abandoned 7 years ago. The full scholarship from Westfield Properties covered not only tuition, but also housing, materials, and even a monthly stipend that allowed her to hire a full-time caregiver for her father. For the first time in years, Sophie could focus on something other than survival. Sophie Bennett, the dean announced, has completed 2 years of study in just 6 months through an accelerated credit program. Her final portfolio, Dresses of Survival, has already been acquired by the Museum of Modern Art for permanent exhibition. Applause erupted. Sophie walked to the stage, but not alone. Elena, Sarah, and 4 other women who had stood up to Brandon accompanied her. They were all wearing dresses Sophie had designed, each telling the story of a woman who refused to be silenced. During the graduation ceremony, Sophie was invited to speak. She stepped up to the microphone wearing a red dress. Not the $320,000 one, but one she had designed and sewn herself. Simple, honest, hers. 6 months ago, Sophie began, her voice echoing through the auditorium, someone told me I would never fit into a dress. What he didn't know was that I had spent years trying to fit into spaces that weren't made for me. Jobs that diminished me. Expectations that crushed me. Silence that suffocated me. She paused, looking out at the audience. In the 3rd row, she saw Robert Westfield sitting discreetly. He had shown up, as he had promised, for every milestone of the women benefiting from the fund. The problem was never the dress. The problem was that I believed I needed to change to deserve respect. That I needed to become smaller, quieter, more convenient for powerful people to tolerate me. Sophie took a deep breath. But something happened in those 90 days. I didn't lose weight to fit someone else's ideal. I gained something much more valuable. I understood that my value was never for sale. And that the best revenge against those who try to humiliate you is not to destroy them. It is to build something so true, so strong, that their opinion becomes just distant noise. Thunderous applause. But Sophie raised her hand. Brandon Westfield is now serving 2,000 hours of community service at a women's shelter. Not because the court ordered it, but because he agreed to it. And you know what I discovered? Real punishment isn't prison. It's a man who has spent his entire life seeing people as objects being forced to listen to them, serve them, recognize their humanity. She looked directly at where Robert was sitting. Some men learn too late that power without humanity is just oppression in expensive clothes. But learning late is still better than never learning. After the ceremony, Sophie was surrounded by journalists. Videos of her journey had accumulated over 15 million views. 3 publishers wanted to publish her book. 5 fashion brands offered consulting services. But the most significant moment came when a 19-year-old girl approached her timidly. "Sorry to bother you," the girl said, her voice trembling. "I saw your video when I was 18. My boss at the restaurant was harassing me. He said no one would believe me because he was respected in the community. But seeing you fight, it changed something. I reported him. He was fired. And now I'm here, the first in my family to go to college." Sophie hugged the girl, feeling the weight of responsibility and the gift that this represented. "You did the hard part. I just showed you that it was possible." "No," the girl insisted, wiping away tears. "You proved that our dignity is not for sale. No matter how much they offer to silence us." Weeks later, Sophie opened a small studio in Brooklyn. Bennett Design specialized in clothing for women of all sizes, all backgrounds, all budgets. Half of the profits went to a fund she had created, the 90 Days Foundation, offering legal support, therapy, and professional training to women facing harassment at work. Elena now ran a non-profit organization dedicated to reforming confidentiality agreement laws that silenced victims. Sarah had returned to technology, this time at a startup focused on secure platforms for reporting harassment. Each of the women who had stood up to Brandon was thriving, not in spite of their trauma, but because they refused to let it define them. Brandon Westfield, on the other hand, lived in a modest apartment in Queens. The inheritance he had hoped to receive was placed in a trust with strict conditions. He would only have access to it after completing 5 years of proven community service and an intensive therapy program. His old friends abandoned him. Exclusive clubs revoked his membership. Invitations to elite events dried up. He discovered that a lost reputation is one of the hardest things to regain. But something strange began to happen. At the shelter where he worked, Brandon began to hear, really hear, the stories of the women who stayed there. Stories of domestic violence, systemic poverty, and discrimination that he had never had to face. One night, 6 months after the settlement, he wrote a letter to Sophie. He didn't expect a reply. He just needed to write. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I need you to know, your courage forced me to look in the mirror for the first time in decades. I saw a monster. I'm not naive enough to think that 2,000 hours of community service will erase years of cruelty. But for the first time in my life, I'm trying to be a decent human being. Not for the court. Not for public relations. Because I finally understand that every person I humiliated was someone. Someone with dreams, pain, dignity. You didn't destroy me. You revealed me. And that was more merciful than I ever was to anyone. Sophie read the letter once, folded it carefully, and put it in a drawer. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Some men learn too late. But the society that allows them to behave with impunity for so long also needs to learn. A year after the original humiliation, the Metropolitan Fashion Gala held a special event, a charity auction where the red dress would be sold. But this time, the narrative was completely different. This dress, the auctioneer announced, represents not the impossible ideal of beauty, but the triumph of human dignity over oppression. All proceeds will go to the 90 Days Foundation. The dress sold for $1.8 million. The anonymous buyer immediately donated it back to the museum with a plaque, in honor of Sophie Bennett and all women who refused to fit into molds that were never made for them. Sophie was in the audience, surrounded by her father in a wheelchair on her left, Nora on her right, and a network of women who had become a family forged in resistance. You did it, her father whispered, squeezing her hand. You turned the worst moment into a movement. I didn't do it alone, Sophie replied, looking around at all the faces that had supported her. No one survives alone. No one wins alone. That night, on her way home, Sophie passed in front of the hotel where she had been humiliated a year ago. She looked at the building for a long moment. Then she smiled and kept walking. Because some places serve to teach you who you no longer want to be. And when you learn that lesson, you don't need to go back. 3 years later, Sophie Bennett, now 31, was an internationally recognized designer. But more than that, she was a voice for women whom society tried to silence. Her TED Talk on turning humiliation into power reached 20 million views. Brandon Westfield still worked in shelters. He still lived modestly. He still carried the weight of past crimes. But for the first time, he was contributing instead of consuming. Planting instead of destroying. The 6 women who had come together remained close friends. They met monthly not to relive trauma, but to celebrate survival. To remind each other that they had won not because they had destroyed the man who had hurt them, but because they had built lives that he could never touch. And the red dress? It remained in the museum with an updated plaque. This dress was never about fitting in. It was about one woman's refusal to let anyone define her worth. May her story inspire you to never fit into expectations that diminish you. If this story moved you, if you have ever been judged for your appearance, silenced for your position, or belittled by those who should respect you, subscribe to the channel and share. Because the greatest revolution is not proving that you can fit into spaces that rejected you. It is creating your own spaces where everyone can belong. The best revenge is not to make your enemies suffer. It is to live so fully that they become irrelevant. It is to build something so true that their lies cannot touch it. It is to become living proof that dignity is not asked for, it is claimed. Sophie learned that the world will try to make you small. It will try to silence you. It will try to make you convenient. But true strength lies in refusing to fit into boxes that were never meant to contain your greatness. Brandon tried to humiliate Sophie. He ended up humiliating only himself. Sophie could have destroyed him. She chose something more powerful. She turned pain into purpose, anger into action, and humiliation into a movement that helped thousands. In the end, the arrogant billionaire learned that money can't buy character. And the invisible cleaning lady proved that true power never comes from a bank account. It comes from refusing to accept anything less than the respect that every person deserves simply for existing. When someone tries to make you feel small, remember, the problem was never your size. It was always their smallness.